I got a bit sidetracked this week because I've been planning on showing you some new .NET 6 features relating to dates and times. And to do that, I was generating an MVC application to demonstrate this. And I realized, of course, that the way that MVC applications, and indeed all of the web applications, get generated has changed because the templates for all these startup projects have changed. And so we saw in the first video I did on C# 10 that the way a console app was generated is now different. Well, a website is actually just a console app, and so we're getting the same sort of issues. And I think the changes are big enough that it's worth putting in a video just to explain how the new structure we see is different from the old structure, but how they all still tie together. So let's do that. And what I'm going to do here is just generate a brand new SP.NET Core Web App Model View Controller. This would be very similar if we were dealing with Web API or Razor Pages or Blazor Pages. The structure of those individual application types hasn't really changed. It's just how the program itself is put together. So let's do an MVC one because it's the simplest one. And I'm going to call this New Style just so we can see that it's the new style that we've got. And I'll go for .NET 6. That's the important one that we're going for there. And leave everything else as it is. Click Create and let that do its stuff. And you can see here we've got our new MVC application. The very first thing to notice, and this is a feature I really like, is that if we look at the run options, it's now defaulted to using the in-process server. So previously it's defaulted to IIS Express, which I'd never use because I don't deploy to IIS. And so the very first thing I do would be to switch that to use the in-process server where it runs up the console as your actual web server. But now that's the default, so that's quite a nice thing. And I'll just run it up so we can see what's happening. So when we run that up, it builds and then it pops up the console that we can see there. And if I just drag over the page there, we can see it's just your standard new MVC application. And if we take a look at the files we've got here, we can see it's still the same structure that we're familiar with. We've got a controllers folder, we've got a models folder, we've got a views folder, we've got a www root for everything that's statically served up. We've still got an app settings.json, so all that is pretty much the same. But what we've got different is that in a traditional SP.NET Core project, we have a program and a startup. And that's the way it's been since the very first days of .NET Core right through to .NET 5. But now in .NET 6, you can see we've only got the program. And if we look at the program, we can see that it's really got all of that stuff that was divided up between the program and the startup. So that is now all done in the program file. Now, to analyze what's going on here, I've also created another project which I've called Old Style, which is actually a .NET 5 project. So here you can see, although most of the structure is still the same, we do now have the separate program and the startup. And then what I've also done in here, I'm going to transfer this over to the New Style one. You can see I've also put in some data access. So we've got a person class and a people context, which is a DB context. So we're connecting to a database, and then in the app settings, I've got an SQL connection to my local SQL server. So that's the sort of thing we've got. I've then also created a people controller, which just creates the context. This was all scaffolded code. I didn't have to write any of this for myself, and we still don't in .NET 6. But if we run that one up, then we can see that it's just got this list of persons that I've put together there, and we can get details, we can edit all the standard sort of stuff. And so let's just see the differences between what we've got there and what we've got in the new style. So remember, in the old style, we have this program, and it's a program that's got a main, and the main calls this create host builder, builds it and runs it, and then the create host builder does the create default builder and basically gets hold of the startup. And then in the startup, we have, as a typical starting point, we have these two methods called configure services, which we use to set up things like any injection. Here I'm using it to set up the DB context. And then after that gets run, we have the configure, which actually puts together the middleware pipeline with all the things we're going to do. And you can see what I've done there. I've got an initialize DB, which is another function down here where I've just created those 4 persons made sure we've got a brand new database and saved it. So that's the sort of thing we might typically want to do. Let's compare that with what we've got in the new version. So if we just go back to that one, and we've got all of this in program, and I think the best thing to do really is just to put some comments on to see where these bits fit together. So the first thing we're doing, that create builder, that is what previously was in main. Now remember, we're already in main here. We've got this idea that we've had for a while that you don't need to write a class program and then in there put a static method called main. If you just write your code directly into a program.cs, that's what gets generated. So that's what we were looking at when I looked at that new style of the console application. So that create builder is basically what we had in our program over here, where we've got, in fact, a create default builder in that case. Something else to notice, again related to this idea of having a main without putting in a class, is args is still there automatically for us. So remember, those are any command line arguments being passed into the program. With the older style, then it's obvious where they come from because we've got to declare that as a parameter to main, whereas here they're just there implicitly, but it's still that array of args. So that's that first bit. Then we can see add controllers with views. Well, that is the first thing that's happening in startup. So that's really the configure services. So let's again put a comment in here. So this one, this section, is all what goes on in configure services. And then we do this app builder.build. And that one is actually kind of, again, getting us back into main, because that's where we do the build there. So that one, we've now jumped out, and that is back in main. Then you can see all of this stuff is setting up the pipeline. So right through to there, that is again in startup, but in this case in configure. So again, let's put that in there. So that's the actual configure part of it rather than the configure services. And then at the very end of it, which we didn't previously have in configure because that's back into program, we've got the run. So that is back in our main. So what we can see is really happening there is with the old style, the bits and pieces were there in separate functions. So you've got the main itself, you've got the configure and the configure services, and the bits from startup, the configure and the configure services, were pulled in at the appropriate point. Whereas here, we've got it all laid out in a much more procedural style, each step that we're going through to put all that together. But we still need to be considering the different jobs that we're doing. Personally, I'm not really a huge fan of this. It seemed to make sense to me to have these separate functions called configure and configure services to do the different parts of the job. Whereas here we can see more clearly what's happening, but we've got to think a little bit more as to where we're going to put things. So the first thing we've got to do, if we're going to make this new style program connect to the old style, is we're going to have the DB context and the connection to the database. So in order to do that, I'll actually do a bit of copying and pasting. So if we just get hold of the file explorer for that, and I'm going to copy that whole data access folder, and if we then go into this new style, and I'll paste that in there. And so that now means that in our new style, we should have the data access. I'm also going to steal the connection string. So if we go into here, there's my connection strings. So let's pop that in there. So none of that has changed from what we used to have. I also need to remember add the appropriate NuGet packages. So let's just do those quickly. That's going to be SQL Server. We're going to need core. So we'll pop all of those in. And what I now need to do is put that into the program and have that all set up for injection and that sort of thing. So if we go back here and look at the various steps for that, the first thing we needed to do was have this bit of code where we configured the DB context and got hold of the connection string from the configuration, which is a property that's set up for us, and put all that together. So let's take that, and we can see it goes in configure services just after the add controller with views. So we can find that in here and pop that in. The problem though is we don't have this thing called services. So services was passed in as a parameter on the older style, but now, well, we can see where we get it from. We have to say builder.services. So it's still there, it's just we've got to fiddle about with a bit. People context, we just need to get hold of the namespace for. Use SQL Server, we just need to get hold of the namespace for. But then configuration, again, we don't have this configuration property. Once again, what we've got to do is we've got to say builder.configuration. So it's the same thing, it's still there, it's just the old version passed it in for us. In the new version, we've got to find it for ourselves. So that's fairly straightforward in terms of what we can do, and that's all part of what used to be configure services. But then we had a little bit more to do, because if we go back to here and now look in configure, we did this initialize DB based on the context. So what we're doing here is having configured the injection of people context. Configure itself, remember, is actually injectable. So we can put anything we want to inject in here, so things like the environment already being injected, as the context, and it will create it using the standard injection rules. And then here I've written another function called initializeDB, and there we've got that, and does ensure deleted, ensure created, and all that sort of thing. So let's actually grab that first. So we'll take that code and we'll put it down at the end here. Now this actually hits us with another problem, because the way we're doing main, we're not actually writing a class called program with a method called main, and therefore would have the ability to add other methods to it. And I mentioned this when we were talking about this non-class based structure for main before. But you can get around it slightly, because if I take off that word private, what I've now got here is actually a local function within the invisible main function that's being generated for us. So local function is an idea that's been around a while. You can put one function inside another and it will be accessible from anywhere in the outer function. And you can do the same thing here. Implicitly, we're already in main and this is a local function inside there. And in fact, I'll make this a static one. That simply means that if we've got any parameters, we've got to pass them in. We can't just pick them up from the scope of the outer function. So I've got an initialized DB here, and that will do all of the work for me. But I still need to get hold of the people context, because remember, in the older version, the people context was injected into configure, but we don't have a configure anymore, so how do we do the injection? Well, we've got to do the injection for ourselves. And this is something we looked at in a video a little while back when I was going into the real in-depth of injection and how you can manage it in non-ASP.NET applications. And so have a look at that if you don't remember. But the way we can do it is like this. What we have to do is, again, get it off the app. So remember, here we are in configure, and we want to get hold of the injected object. So I'm going to say var context, so that's going to be my people context, equals, and then I say app.services. So there we've got services, and in fact, it's remembering this from last time I did it, we've got this get required service. So if I just do a get required service on that, and then I can just pass that in to the local function initializeDB. So if I just say initializeDB and pass in the context, then that achieves pretty much exactly the same as we had in the original one, that we had it injected and then we initialized it. But let's run that up and see what happens. And you can see we get this problem saying cannot resolve scope service and then the people context. And the reason for that is, if again you remember back to that video I did on injection, when we configure things for injection, we can either configure them as transient, when they just get created brand new every time they're needed, or at the other extreme, singleton, where you only ever get one of them. But the middle ground, and the way that DB contexts are always configured, is what is known as scoped. And scope, in terms of a web application, basically means they're scoped for an entire request response cycle. But we're not at that point yet. We're here just in the configuration. And so, again, like we saw in the earlier video, I've got to actually do my own scoping. So what I have to do here is actually put it in a using block. So I'm going to say using, and then all of that. And then I'm going to say var scope equals app.services dot create scope. So that will manually create me the scope that this is going to go into. And then let's have our using block. And then also then on the scope, we can say dot service provider, get required service, all of that. And so that gives us our context that we can pass in and do the initial setup. And so now if we run that, we can see that it's happily got through that, no errors. So it's managed to create that context and populate it. So that's what we had there. So it gets a bit tricky because you've got to remember to do your own create scope in this case. Whereas in the old style one, that was just done for us behind the scenes when the injection was done into configure. But that's got that working. Next thing we need to do, and this now works exactly the same, really the changes were just there in that program, but let's put in a controller, but so I can do that in exactly the same way. So if we just, well, let's do a couple of changes. Let's delete the existing home controller and the associated views. And then let's do an add controller and MVC controller using Entity Framework. I'll select my type, which was our person, and my DB context, which is the people context. Leave everything else the same. Let it do a bit of work. And so it's created the controller, it's created the views. The one last thing we want to do is just back in the program, just change the default controller to be people rather than home. But now if I run that up and drag that over, we can now see exactly the same behavior as we had in the old style one. So all of that stuff for the controllers, the models, the views, the scaffolding, all that's exactly the same. It was purely the fact that we've lost startup and therefore we have to put the stuff that used to be in startup into program to make it work. But everything else is now working there. So that was the basic changes we have to make. I have to say, personally, I don't really like this new style of doing it. I liked the idea of separating things out into configure services and configure. It was clear where things are meant to go. And although this kind of simplicity may be beneficial in a very, very basic program, certainly the kinds of websites that I'm writing get complicated enough that the saving here, if there is any, starts to become quite minimal. But if you just look at this code, if you just scroll through that, we start to see that this is turning into quite a big function. And that just goes against basic programming principles that you should break things down into small functions doing a particular job, like configure services and configure. That seemed to be the right way to do it. So I'm not sure, I haven't started a brand new commercial project with .NET 6 yet, so I don't know if I'll find I can live with this or whether I would start restructuring it back to the old style, which is of course still perfectly okay. You can still do your separate configure and configure services. It's just not what gets generated with the template. A couple of other little things to look at here. One thing I think is worth mentioning, there are lots of other smaller changes and improvements, but I should just point out this one, because remember I copied that code over from .NET 5. This has actually been slightly simplified in .NET 6. So if I just copy that, so you can just have the old one there for reference, but I'll comment it out. Because what we can now do is, on here, we can actually, rather than doing an add DB context, we can do an add SQL server. So we say add SQL server with the people context, and then we don't need to have that slightly complicated way of doing things. We can just pass the connection string straight into the add SQL server, and that will do the same as the one I've commented out. So it's just a slight minor fix, but I thought I'd point that out because I had copied over the code that worked, but is a little bit out of date. And so there we can see that's working in exactly the same way. The other thing I thought I'd mention is just a little bit of the reasoning behind why it's been changed to work like this. And that's because there's quite a drive within .NET 6 to go for the idea of a minimal website, be it a web API or MVC or whatever it may be. And if you're writing something that's a very, very simple site, which, as I say, I don't really do, but if you've got that, then you can do it with very little code indeed. Because if I just, let's comment the entire of this out for now, and then just put this all together. So I'm going to have a var builder equals, and then this is going to be basically taken from that first line there. So we create our builder. I'm then going to, from the builder, create the app. So I'll say var app equals builder.build. And again, that was hidden in there, just up there. And then I'm going to write this absolutely minimal website. And it could be more complicated than this, but this gets it going. I'm going to say app.map, and then let's go for map get. So this is just going to respond to a get request. I could have done posts and puts and other things, but we're keeping it very simple. And then you can put in the path. So let's just have index. And then you can put in the function that is going to respond to a request on that path. Again, much more you can do with this, but this is showing it really simple. And I do that with a lambda, and all I'm going to do is return my minimal website. And then at the end of all that, we've got to do, again, what we had before, app.run. So put that in there, and then run that up. There we've got the site, but not showing anything because I've got to put in that slash index that I put on there. But there you can see it's just saying my minimal website. So obviously you do a bit more than that, but if you had a relatively simple website, you could just put a very small amount of code into your main, and we can see we've just got that there. But personally, I prefer a bit more of the structure, and so that's why I will, I think, in future still go with something that uses the configure services and the configure, but it really is just moving the various bits and pieces around. It's still basically the same structure that we've got there. So I hope that was helpful. It is a bit of a surprise when you create your first application. It suddenly looks completely different from what you're used to. But we've covered the main things that you can do there. Understanding what is main, what is configure services. Understanding how we can do dependency injection, and also how the fact is that if we want to use an injected object in what used to be configure, we've got to take control of that for ourselves and maybe also worry about scoping of it. And then we saw how really the rest of it is pretty similar. So next time, I hope to get back to what I was hoping to look at before, this idea of the new date and time features. But if that was helpful, do click like, do subscribe, and I'll see you soon.